Welcome back, everyone. Dr. James Broomall of Shepherd University and the George Southern Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War, and I'm joined by Christian Webb. Since our last stop, the rain has started and it's coming down quite heavily, as you may gather. But Christian was kind enough to offer us this actually incredibly quaint porch, and we are situated right now in downtown Winchester. You can get some sense of the architecture. We wanted to take you a bit through the streets. That's no longer possible. But before turning it over to Christian, I want to give us a couple insights into the experiences for white Southern women and enslaved men and women in this region, because just as these armies are fighting across this area and going back and forth in battle, as I hinted at the last stop, that's dramatically impacting these Southern populations. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the Valley, Cornelia MacDonald will be a familiar name. She has some of the best primary source accounts of the civilian experience, and MacDonald bears witness to the chaos that unfolds in the streets of Winchester, writing, "At different points the battle continued through the streets in one hurried mass. From that point, arms, accoutrements, clothes, everything was thrown away as they sped along, closely followed by their victorious foes who never paused except to give a word or a smile to the friends on the streets who greeted them." It gives you some sense, though, of the chaos unfolding in downtown Winchester as this fight is unfolding. But more importantly, I think, is to take a pause and gain some altitude. Because when I first started in Middletown, I said in the 18th century, enslaved populations in the valley were relatively low. But I hinted in the post-revolutionary era, enslaved populations continued to grow, and indeed by the Civil War era, if we look at the valley writ large, about 20% of the population is enslaved. In places like Clark County, that approaches near 50%. And for African Americans who toiled in the valley, the proximity to Union forces is going to begin to impact their lives in manifold ways. And I will note, again, for those of you who are familiar with the timeline of the Civil War, Lincoln has yet to issue his Emancipation Proclamation, but the enslaved has started to act, and act in very decisive ways. And so as these Union troops are coming into the valley in the spring, late spring, early summer of 1862, we have some pretty specific primary source materials that are documenting what becomes a pretty large exodus of those individuals who are toiling on small farms and large plantations throughout the lower valley. And many Union soldiers are cognizant of this trickle, which eventually becomes a flood of black refugees, in many cases going to the lower valley, from there to Harper's Ferry, and in many instances eventually seeking refuge in the areas around Washington, D.C., which will eventually host about 50,000 black refugees set up in a series of camps around that area. But Union soldiers whose views on race vary dramatically do make frequent commentary on this fact. One Union soldier, James Dunn, writing in June of 1862, just sort of outside the boundaries of the Valley Campaign, said that in the valley you can hardly see, and I'll just say, an African American. They are all most up now in Harper's Ferry building entrenchments and doing the hard labor that our poor soldiers would have to do if not there. You can get some sense of that racialized language. But this Dunn account stands representative for many Union soldiers who make note in the spring and summer of 1862 of this basically exodus of enslaved individuals who, again, are passing through these Union lines, hoping in many cases to seek refuge within the fold of Union armies, and then from there carving out their own paths to find their own ways to freedom. And so I think that that's a pretty important backdrop for this overall story, that while perhaps the Union Army has maintained focus on a war for Union and perhaps the abolition of slavery, the enslaved very clearly have taken matters into their own hands and have decisively made a statement about what they think ultimately this war should be, and that, of course, is a war for universal equality and for the liberation of those enslaved. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christian, who's going to wrap up our fighting in and around Winchester, and give us a concluding point. Again, we had projected perhaps some other sites today, but the weather is simply not going to allow it. And so with that, Christian, please.
Okay. So, all right, guys. So once the battle has concluded at Bowers Hill and at Camp Hill for the First Battle of Winchester, Banks and his army is going to run rampant through the streets of what is now known as Loudon Street and Braddock Street. They're going to be pushing towards the Potomac River in Williamsport and portions of West Virginia. Jackson's army is going to take hold of Winchester, and what to take away from the Battle of Winchester as well as Front Royal, these two specific battles, is that it pauses McDowell's movement to Richmond. McClellan was impatiently waiting for McDowell's movement to Richmond to reinforce him. Not that he needed it, but he was impatiently waiting for those 60,000 fresh troops to come and reinforce him against Lee. That's no longer happening. Now McDowell is going to be sitting even longer in Fredericksburg, and Shields' division is going to be moving towards Harrisonburg now, along with Fremont, in the direction of Jackson, to defeat Jackson and push him out, because now Jackson poses a big threat to Washington D.C., which causes panic to not only Abraham Lincoln, but as well as Abraham Lincoln's cabinet, as well as everyone within Washington, D.C. So now there's a huge panic within the federal government, citizens of Washington, D.C., and now McClellan is panicking himself because he is convinced that he is going up against a much larger army in Richmond than he's actually going up against. So these two battles solidify much panic within the federal ranks as well as the federal government within Washington, D.C. And one more thing to take away from this is that these two battles ignite a lot of oral histories that will go on within the next years, decades, within the legacy of Stonewall Jackson and the Valley Campaign. And all of that cannot happen without that of Jed Hotchkiss and his map-making abilities, his knowledge of the Valley. And so because of that, Jackson was able to maneuver around the army at a very swift pace, was able to exploit the weaknesses of Banks' army, eventually Fremont's army, as well as Shields' division that we will learn about at some point at Port Republic and Cross Keys.
Thank you, Christian. And yeah, I think one of the points today was to really, for those of you who still are perhaps live too far away or are housebound for sundry reasons, is to give you just some insights at the actual places. We again are incredibly fortunate as to where we're located. Most of these sites were an hour and a half away. And so we wanted to just bring you to the ground. And I think, you know, this type of history can be best learned when you're actually at the places where it unfolded. And although the preservation efforts have varied, although the modern encroachments in some cases have been profound, I still think you can get some sense of place. And again, my last plug here, Civil War trails. We almost in every instance stopped at Civil War trails marker. And so for those of you who are looking to embark upon an auto tour of your own, as well as a walking tour, because we always encourage that, please do visit Civil War trails. Those sites are just exquisitely marked and will really get you navigating through some of the difficult areas, which if you don't know well, they'll provide the guidance for you. And so with that, thank you very much for joining us. I know we've had a bit of technical difficulties today. This was really the first time we tried a multi-stage operation of this sort, and I think ultimately it's successful. And so with that, well, thank you very much for tuning in, and we will look forward to seeing you in the next program. In the meantime, stay healthy and be well. Thank you.